the door, the gates of the door. Why did it do that? It's very hard. They have about 4 hypotheses, but they have no evidence for any of their hypotheses. And I've gone into a lot of this in detail. I could write a 1,000-page book, but ended up writing a 125-page book because no one would read a 1,000-page book. That's what I was told. I believe them. Here's how I think water gaps formed during the flood. You had flood currents draining. Remember, we're draining and the water's channelizing. And it's going perpendicular to a ridge or a plateau. And as it's doing that, there's low spots that form. And it takes advantage of low spots and accelerates through them, cutting it deeper like a chain reaction. And deeper. To the point where it cuts it all the way down to when it's all over with, the river runs through it. So that's how I think water gaps formed in the flood. In fact, we have an analog of the formation of a water gap during the Lake Missoula flood. How many have heard of the Lake Missoula flood? Many of you. That was a huge flood during the peak of the Ice Age in western Montana, 2,000-foot deep lake, and it was blocked by ice, about 2,500 feet. And it was raising year by year, and suddenly, ice floats. And so it floated through its barrier and broke through its barrier. Within 2 days, emptied out through eastern Washington and caused the channeled scablands, 400 feet over Spokane, 400 feet going over Portland, Oregon. And when it came to us, this area in southeast Washington, here's the Snake River right here. It goes down to the Columbia. You had Washtuckna Coulee right in here that ends up in the Columbia River. The Palouse River used to go down Washtuckna Coulee like this. But when the flood came, it overtopped a 500-foot ridge and started wide, and then it cut a narrow gorge down 500 feet in lava, basalt lava. So after the Lake Missoula flood, the Palouse River didn't take its normal course, but took a left-hand turn and went through that and down into the Snake River in what is now would be called a water gap. And Palouse Falls is part of this water gap. Another feature that the channelized flow can form is what's called pediments. Pediments are flat planation surfaces at the edge of mountains. In Montana, we have lots of them. In Arizona, there's lots of them. I believe there's probably a fair amount of them in Colorado. They're flat surfaces on the edge of the mountains. This is one near the Tobacco Root Mountains, close to where I live. It's about 30 square miles. It's flat and has rounded rocks by water action. Sometimes it's cut into the sides of the mountains. Sometimes it cuts the valley fills. Here's another pediment, what's called the Ruby Valley of southwest Montana. The sedimentary rocks are dipping like this. You can see the dip right here. But the pediment cuts at a low angle against the dip, which nature doesn't do. And here's the rocks that you see on top of the pediment, rounded by water. So water cut the pediment. Pediments are often found in valleys. So it would fit in with the channelized flow of the flood real easy. And that's how I think it formed. Instead of the water going perpendicular, the water was going parallel to the ridges. And as ridges form, they'll crack at the top. And when they crack at the top, they'll erode faster there than they will in the lower areas. And so you'll end up that the bowing will end up being the valley. This is a very common feature you see in mountainous terrains, by the way. So the water is moving pretty fast, cutting down. And then the sides show up, and the whole valley is filled with water. And it's going so fast, maybe 100 miles an hour, that it's planing the edges of the valley down to a flat surface called pediments. That's how I think they formed during the flood. And so as the flood waters drain out through the valleys and ends, you end up with flat surfaces at the edges of mountains. Pediments are not forming today. There's some people that have claimed they have, but it's because they expect them to form today because they're there. There are thousands of pediments all over the earth. Thousands. This is by a guy named Dorand, saying that we don't really know. He says pediments have long been a subject to geomorphological scrutiny. Unfortunately, the net result of this long history of study is not altogether clear or cogent, and has not produced a clear understanding of the processes responsible for pediment development. What he is saying, I was a weather forecaster for 30 years, and I was a master of weasel words. 30% chance of rain. It may rain or may not. It may be windy, it may not. May get cold, may not. You know, as a master of weasel words, I can tell when someone else is using them. And these are weasel words for saying we haven't got a clue how pediments form. And they don't. They have about 3 or 4 hypotheses which I have analyzed, and they all have serious problems. I'm going to move on to another feature formed during the channelized flow, but instead of an erosional feature like pediments and water gaps, I'm going to talk about no, this is an erosional feature. Excuse me. This is the formation of submarine canyons. Now, these are the submarine canyons. There's about, well over 100 or 200. These are perpendicular gashes in the continental slope, perpendicular to the slope. And they're deep. The average depth is 3,000 feet, and the average length is 50 miles. Many of these submarine canyons are deeper than Grand Canyon. And at least one of them, the Bering Submarine Canyon, is longer than Grand Canyon. So submarine canyons are Grand Canyons that you don't see because they're covered by water. Now these are not deep sea trenches. Those are way out in the ocean, or actually some are close to the continents, but they generally parallel the continents. These go perpendicular, and they start right on the continental shelf. In fact, some of them start almost near the beach. In fact, there's one submarine canyon called the Monterey Canyon that starts right near the pier at Moss Landing. In fact, if that submarine canyon backs up anymore, the whole pier is going to go crashing down into the submarine canyon. The same thing as at Scripps.